Don't forget to subscribe. Afterwards, the wisest and most spiritual books from the greatest authors await you every day. And now buckle up, sit back and we'll begin. The Tibetan Book of the Dead. Preface. Years ago, my original teacher, the Venerable Geshen Gawang Wangyal of the Labsam Shedrub Monastery, gave me a copy of a Tibetan volume printed in India, entitled The Tibetan Book of the Dead. He had a way of saying certain things so that you remembered them long afterward, giving them a special impact, as if the words stood outside of time. Here, you are going to need this. At the time, working on this book was not a priority for me. But I kept it carefully, knowing my teacher's insight, and thinking that someday I probably would need it. I had long known the old translation of the same text by Kazi Dawa Samdap and W.H.Y. Evans Wentz, which had started the misnomer, the Tibetan Book of the Dead. I had read it and used it when relatives and friends died. It described a very real process through which we all have to go after death, and before the next life that we will most probably have to face. I had also read the Francesca Fremantle and Chajim Trungpa Rinpoche version, writing a review of it for a scholarly journal some time ago. In spite of its psychologized metaphysic and terminology, it was an improvement on the earlier translation. The Tibetan Book of the Dead was written by the great master Padmasambhava in the 8th or 9th century for Indian and Tibetan Buddhists. It was hidden by him for a later era and was discovered by the renowned treasure finder Karma Lingpa in the 14th century. It organizes the experiences of the between Tibetan, Bardo, usually referring to the state between death and rebirth according to the expectations of initiates in a particular esoteric mandala, a sacred universe, the mandala of the 100 mild and fierce Buddha deities. In recent years, I have studied the unexcelled Yoga Tantras, especially the Guhya Samaja, or esoteric communion, tradition, so lucidly explicated by Lama Jait Tsongkhapa, 1357–1419. Unexcelled Yoga Tantra is a highly technical approach to inner experiences, an ancient tradition of spiritual techniques, every bit as sophisticated as modern material technologies. It uses special yogically induced states to explore the nature of the self and the mind, of death, life, and the between states. It describes death in great detail. Its physiology, its psychology, its normal experience, and its simulated experience in experimental yogas of trance states. I have found it lucid and useful, not only for thinking about death, but also for thinking about life, health, and even breath. When I encountered death, thinking about my own or losing friends, this spiritual science gave me a framework within which I could understand the process. After these unexcelled yoga studies, when I looked back at the Tibetan Book of the Dead, it seemed less relevant to me and to modern experiences of death and dying. After all, it was intended to be a popular manual designed for the ordinary Tibetan layperson and not for the yogic adept. I noted that Stephen Levine and other developers of yogas for dying for contemporary Americans had found its imagery too cumbersome and unfamiliar for the ordinary person confronting his or her death. How many people in Toledo or Topeka can cope with a Haruka, a heroic male archetype deity, or a Dakini, a dynamic female angel? A peaceful deity? A wrathful deity? Wouldn't it be better for them to use manuals for dying developed within their native Jewish or Christian faith? The technical descriptions of death in the esoteric communion literature seemed more clear and systematic. though not written for use by ordinary people when confronting the death process. Thus, when Bantam Books first approached me to do a new translation of the basic text with a popular commentary, I was uncertain about taking on the project. I might have declined altogether had not my teacher's words arisen in my memory. I went home and looked through the Evans Wentz and the Fremantle and Trungpa versions. I skimmed passages of the Tibetan edition my teacher had given me. I realized that people who are dying need something more clear, usable, and accessible than those translations. To begin with, we all need to escape from the misleading title, or at least reduce it to a subtitle. No Tibetan expression is translatable as Book of the Dead. In the actual Tibetan title, Bardo Thodol, Bardo simply means the between state. In common parlance, the between refers to the whole process between death and rebirth. More technically, Tibetans discern 6 betweens: the intervals between birth and death, life between, sleep and waking, dream between, waking and trance, trance between, and 3 betweens during the death-rebirth process: death point, reality, and existence betweens. Thospa refers to one of 3 types of wisdom or understanding, those developed by learning, reflecting, and meditating. The words Thodol mean that this book's teaching liberates just by being learned or understood, giving the person facing the between an understanding so naturally clear and deep that it does not require prolonged reflection or contemplation. So the most common Tibetan title of the work is the Great Book of Natural Liberation Through Understanding in the Between, Bardo Thodol Chenmo. It is itself a subsection of a larger work called The Profound Teaching of the Natural Liberation Through Contemplating the Mild and Fierce Buddha Deities. I became inspired by such reflections. I decided to try to produce a version that would be simple and useful, easy for bereaved relatives to read, and easy for lost souls to hear in the room where they anxiously hover about their corpses and wonder what has happened to them. At the same time, I would put in the commentary a technical description of the death process gleaned from the larger Tibetan literature on unexcelled yoga. The result is this book. As I was working on the text, I found other Tibetan editions that seemed more reliable and often clarified obscurities in the edition printed in India my teacher had given me. I also found some previously untranslated sections of the larger work, which clarified the teaching. I have included them here as appendices. Working on this text has been a fascinating and rewarding experience. I am once again grateful to my late teacher. I hope you also will find it useful. Part 1. Preparations for the Journey. Chapter 1. An outline of Tibetan history. The Tibetans have always called their own country Bo, on some occasions adding Kawajan, land of snows. Their own recorded history dates back some 2,300 years, to the time of the Macedonian Greek Empire in the West, the Mauryan Empire in India, and the late Chou Empire in China. During Tibet's first 8 centuries, it was ruled by a military dynasty. It had an animistic religious system, run by a priesthood of shamans adept in divination, sorcery, and sacrifice. Its polity centered on a royal family believed to have descended from the heavens. The first 7 kings came down to rule on a magical ladder hanging in space, up which they would return when their time had come to die. Due to some conflict in the palace, the 8th king cut the sky rope, and the kings thereafter, like the pharaohs of Egypt, were interred in large burial mounds, along with possessions and companions. The early dynasty was centered in the Yarling Valley, a river valley running south from the eastward flowing Tsangchu, the Brahmaputra, near present-day Setang. Gradually, over the centuries, the dynasty added tribes and territories to its domain, uniting the lords of neighboring kingdoms in a feudal, military network. The tribes they unified were already tied by three main common bonds: their territory, language, and religious tendency. They all inhabited the approximately 1 million square mile Tibetan plateau, with an average altitude of 13,000 to 14,000 feet. Living successfully at such an altitude involves a complex physiological adaptation. To be comfortable there, you really have to be born there from a lineage long acclimatized. The Tibetan language belongs to the Tibeto-Burman language family, a family distinct from the Indic, Dardic, Turkic, Mongolian, and Sinitic language families of the surrounding lowland areas. Religiously, Tibetans tended to deify elements of nature, especially mountains and sky, and shared a complex set of rituals of sacrifice, divination, and propitiation of a diverse pantheon of underworld, landscape, and celestial deities. The high-altitude culture was distinguished from those around it by its more spiritual orientation. Lifespans at high altitude are somewhat shortened, and the stark and spectacular mountain landscape is conducive to reflection and contemplation. In the early centuries, this spirituality was practical in outlook. Like most shamanisms, it sought mundane success, victory, health, wealth, and progeny. During the period of military expansion, it seems to have focused on a cult of kingship, run by shamanic adept priests. Since the king had descended from heaven as a divinity on earth, he guaranteed power and order. The shaman assisted this order by inviting the king's descent, celebrating his presence, securing the cooperation of the deities in the heavens, lands, and underworld, and managing the transition from the old king to the new. The shaman was required to travel to the land of the dead and back in order to gain personal experience of the period of chaos between reigns. His role was to draw on the power of chaos while keeping it in its place, assuring its continuing separation from the land of the living, the realm of order. The Tibetan dynastic culture was quite successful for many centuries. Rival kingdoms from surrounding lowlands could not intrude for long on the high plateau, so it was allowed to develop without interference. The Tibetans' struggles with their natural environment and with each other strengthened them, and by the 6th century they had unified the highland and become an empire to be reckoned with. They began to mount campaigns in all directions into the lowlands. At this time they developed a fearsome reputation among the Chinese, Turkish, Mongolian, Persian, and Indic peoples. In the early 7th century, an emperor named Songtsen Gampo reached the militaristic empire's natural limits. Unity among warlords is always tenuous, and the high-altitude Tibetans had no interest in further expansion outward into the lowlands. He began transforming the civilization from feudal militarism to something more peaceful and spiritual, based on the people's cultivated moral outlook. In working on this transformation, Songtsen Gampo investigated the major civilizations of outer, from his perspective, Asia, and noted that Universalist, Mahayana, Buddhism provided the cultural backbone of the Pala and post-Gupta dynasties of India, the Silk Route city-states of Central Asia, and the Tang dynasty of China. So he began a systematic process of cultural adaptation. He sent a team of scholars to India to learn Sanskrit, create a written language for Tibetan, and begin to translate the vast Buddhist literature. He married 9 princesses from different surrounding countries, including Nepal and Tang China, requesting each to bring Buddhist artifacts and texts with her to Tibet. He built a geomantic system of imperial temples, centered on the Jokhang and Ramosh cathedrals in his new capital at Lhasa, with a network of branch temples, creating a pattern of sacredness to contain the nation. For the next 2.5 centuries, his successors continued his work of cultural transformation, sponsoring translations, holding research conferences, building institutions, and educating their subjects. This process reached a high point during the 790s, in the reign of Emperor Trisong Detsen, who, with the help of the Indian adept Padmasambhava and the Indian Buddhist abbot Shantarakshita, built the first monastery at Sami. Here the Indian Buddhist university structure and curriculum were transplanted, and a 60-year process of collecting all the useful knowledge then available in Asia was begun. Mathematics, poetry, medicine, the art of government, art and architecture, all these branches of learning were cultivated, not only Buddhist philosophy and psychology. Scholars were invited from Persia, India, Iguria, Mongolia, the Silk Route states, and Tang China, and Tibetans became skilled at comparison and combination in their quest for the best understanding of man and nature. For example, during the 830s, hundreds of scholars from all over the known world spent a decade comparing the medical systems of India, China, Persia, Mongolia, and Iguria, creating a Tibetan medical system that integrated the best available psychology, anatomy, neurology, surgery, botany, chemistry, and nutrition with Buddhist spiritual technology. After this high point of Sami's ascendancy, a period of confusion ensued, precipitated by excessive pressure from the emperors in their injection of Buddhist perspectives and practices into all facets of life. There was a revolt within the royal family itself. A series of assassinations and coups ended with the collapse of the dynasty, the regional fragmentation of the nation, and the temporary suppression of Buddhism. Within a century, however, Buddhist insights and institutions re-emerged, now rooted among the people, with sponsorship from regional rulers. For the next 3 centuries, Tibetans more and more turned their interests toward Buddhist education, and monasteries were built all over the country. The vast work of translation was completed, and a voluminous indigenous literature was developed. No new royal dynasty emerged to control the whole country. Tibetan militarism was unable to return due to the power of Buddhism and its morality of nonviolence. Local noble families still ruled regional areas, but more and more they shared even their social and political power with the rapidly developing monastic institutions. During the 13th and 14th centuries, the Mongolian Empire unified most of Eurasia, and Tibet was formally incorporated within the Pax Mongolica. In reality, it was very little changed, divided into 13 main administrative regions, each run by a combination of a local ruling family and a local monastic hierarchy. The Sakya hierarchy and the Khan family were formally put in charge overall by Kublai Khan, but the Sakya hierarch was more of a spiritual figurehead than an active administrator. Toward the end of the 14th century, the Mongol Empire fell apart, and the native Tibetan dynasty of Pagmadru asserted control over Tibet. At the same time, a spiritual renaissance was ushered in by the life work of Lama Jate Tsongkhapa. The new era of national dedication to the practice of Buddhism as the main aim of life was sealed by his founding the Great Prayer Festival in Lhasa in 1409. He offered celestial ornaments to the Jowo Rinpoche image of Shakyamuni Buddha, enshrined in the Jokhang Cathedral, to symbolize the nation's realization of the eternal presence of the Buddha. A tradition thus began for the whole nation to come together for 2 weeks of prayer and celebration every Lunar New Year. The keys of the city were turned over to the monastic abbots, and all ordinary business was suspended. This festival was a core event for all Tibet from 1409 until 1960, when the Chinese occupation stopped it by force. During the 15th and 16th centuries, the Renaissance initiated by Tsongkhapa transformed the spiritual, social, and physical landscape of Tibet. In region after region, monastery building intensified as more and more men and women became determined to dedicate their precious human lives, endowed with freedom and opportunity, to fulfill their evolution and attain enlightenment. The social climate became more and more peaceful as fewer and fewer individuals were available for the armies of the remaining local warlords. One of Tsongkhapa's younger disciples, Gendon Drugpa, led the New Geluk order during a long and creative life of inspiring teaching, writing, and building. After his death, a beautiful young boy in another region claimed to be Gendon Drugpa from the moment he could talk. After many tests and miraculous recognitions, he was accepted by the community as the actual reincarnation of the great master, and he was raised and educated to fulfill the same leadership role as the Lama Gendon Gyatso. His subsequent reincarnation, discovered through similar miracles, tests, and demonstrated abilities, Sonam Gyatso, led the order in the 16th century until during an historic visit to Mongolia in 1573, he was named Dalai Lama, Oceanic Master, by the Mongolian Emperor Altan Khan. Including his 2 predecessors retroactively, Sonam Gyatso became known as His Holiness the Third Dalai Lama. During Sonam Gyatso's time and that of his successor, the warlord rulers of Tibet had begun to feel too constrained by the steady wave of spiritual renaissance, popular dedication to enlightenment education, and money and time-consuming monastery building. A period of turbulence ensued around the turn of the 17th century, with the fate of the country in the balance. Would the secular forces of the remaining militaristic aristocratic warlords prevail, curtailing the ascendancy of the monastery-centered lifestyle, in parallel with what was happening at the time in Northern Europe, China, and Japan? Or would they give up their ways of violence, lay down their arms, and, once and for all, themselves embrace the path of spiritual evolution? In 1642, almost exactly 1,000 years after the building of the Jokhang Cathedral, His Holiness the Fifth Dalai Lama, 1617–1682, was crowned King of Tibet, founding the Ganden Palace Victory government that Tibetans still consider their legitimate government today. The Great Fifth, as he is known, created a unique form of government eminently suited to Tibet's special society. It was almost completely demilitarized, acknowledging the centrality of the monastic institutions in the national life and the priority given to nonviolence. The nobility was virtually expropriated, retaining the use and income from parts of their hereditary estates only as salary for service to the Ganden government. They were completely deprived of their private armies, losing their feudal power of life and death over their peasants, who up to then had closely resembled the medieval serfs of Russia and Europe. Internationally, Tibetan independence and national integrity were guaranteed by the new Pan-Asian emperors of the era, the Manchus. A Tungusic people from the forests north of Korea, they conquered northern China in 1644 and wished to conquer the rest of East Asia, undisturbed by any rivals. Due to his authority over the fearsome Mongols, the Dalai Lama was seen as a potent ally by the new Manchu emperor. In 1651, an alliance was formed between the Manchu Shunche emperor and the Great Fifth. The Manchus recognized the Dalai Lama's secular authority over Tibet and his spiritual authority over the world as they knew it. The Dalai Lama recognized the Manchus as legitimate rulers of Manchuria and China and as international protectors of the Buddhist Dharma, its practitioners, and institutions. The bottom line was that the Dalai Lama agreed to encourage the Mongols to practice Buddhism, and the Manchus agreed to protect the peace for the demilitarized Buddhist societies. The Tibetan pacification of the Mongols, the demilitarization of that most militarily powerful society, is one of the remarkable social transformations in history, though it is no more astonishing than Tibet's self-transformation over the previous millennium. Tibet? A spiritual civilization. During the 3 centuries of Tibet's modern period, the national priority was on monastic education, literary and philosophical creativity, the practice of meditation, the development of ritual and festival arts, and so forth. Spiritual adepts were accepted as the highest level of Tibetan society, considered to have become perfected Buddhas through their practice of the tantras, spiritual technologies, of unexcelled yoga, self-cultivation. They were inner-world adventurers of the highest daring, the Tibetan equivalent of our astronauts. I think it is worth coining the term psychonaut to describe them. They personally voyaged to the furthest frontiers of that universe which their society deemed vital to explore. The inner frontiers of consciousness itself, in all its transformations in life and beyond death. In Western culture, the last frontiers of our material conquest of the universe are in outer space. Our astronauts are our ultimate heroes and heroines. Tibetans, however, are more concerned about the spiritual conquest of the inner universe, whose frontiers are in the realms of death, the between, and contemplative ecstasies. So, the Tibetan lamas who can consciously pass through the dissolution process, whose minds can detach from the gross physical body and use a magic body to travel to other universes, these psychonauts are the Tibetans' ultimate heroes and heroines. The Dalai Lamas and the several thousand reincarnate lamas, also called Tulku, which means Buddha emanation, are these heroes and heroines. They are believed to have mastered the death, between, and rebirth processes, and to choose continuously, life after life, to return to Tibet out of compassion to lead the Tibetans in their spiritual national life, and to benefit all sentient beings. Thus the modern Tibetan civilization was unique on the planet. Only such a special civilization could have produced the arts and sciences of dying and death transmitted in this book. I describe the unique psychological character complex that corresponds to the modern Tibetan society as inner modernity. It should be understood to contrast with the modern Western psychological character complex, which can be described as outer modernity. The Western character complex is usually contrasted with a pre-modern traditional character. It is often described as a complex of traits such as individualism, openness and flexibility of identity, restless reflectiveness, and adherence to rationality. This modern Western character complex is connected with a peculiar perception of all things, including psychic or mental things, as ultimately reducible to quantifiable material entities. This is what gives it its outwardness. The modern Tibetan character complex shares the modern traits of individualism, openness and flexibility of identity, reflectiveness, and rationality. But the Tibetan character is bound up with its peculiar perception, derived from Buddhist civilization, of all things as infused with spiritual value, as interconnected with mental states. In contrast to Western ideas, the Tibetan view is that the mental or spiritual cannot always be reduced to material quanta and manipulated as such. The spiritual is itself an active energy in nature, subtle but more powerful than the material. The Tibetan view is that the strong force in nature is spiritual, not material. This is what gives the Tibetan character its inwardness. Thus, while Western and Tibetan personalities share the complex of modernity of consciousness, they are diametrically opposed in outlook, one focused outward on matter and the other inward on mind. This difference of personality underlies the difference between the two civilizations. While the American national purpose is ever greater material productivity, the Tibetan national purpose is ever greater spiritual productivity. Spiritual productivity is measured by how deeply one's wisdom can be developed, how broadly one's compassion can exert itself. Tibetan Buddhists believe that outer reality is interconnected with inner mental development over a beginningless and endless series of lives, so they see no limit to how far the self and the environment can be transformed for the better. The self can become a Buddha, a being of perfect wisdom and compassion, and the environment can become a perfect Buddha land, wherein no one suffers pointlessly, and all are there for the happiness of all. The ultimate example of the inwardly directed rationality of the modern Tibetan mind is precisely our present concern, the Tibetan exploration of death. The outwardly directed Western mind long ago dismissed the topic of death and future lives as archaic, of concern only to the superstitious traditional mind. Materialistic habits of thought reduce the mind to matter and eliminate the soul. Ruling out the possibility of future lives, death is merely a physiological condition, equated with a flat line on an electroencephalograph. There is no interest at all in the states of the person or condition of the mind after death. Scientific investigation restricts itself to the material quanta perceivable by the physical senses, augmented by machinery, during this one bodily life. At the same time, Westerners have set about exploring the outer world, the farthest continents, the macro realms of the outer galaxies, and the micro realms of the cell, the molecule, the atom, and the subatomic forces. Tibetan inwardly directed reason put the material world second on its list of priorities. Its prime concern was the world of inner experience, the waking, gross realm of causality, relativity, sensation, percept and concept, and the subtle realm of image, light, ecstasy, trance, dream, and finally, death and its beyond. The Tibetans considered the inner, subtlemost, experiential realm the important point at which to assert control of all subjective and objective cosmic events. And so they set about exploring this inner world, using analytic insight and contemplative concentration to extend their awareness into every crevice of experience. They used the manipulation of dreams and inner visions to visit lucidly the territories of the unconscious. They used focused disidentification with coarse subjectivity to gain access to the subtlest level of sentience. And they used an augmented sense of mindfulness and memory to gain access to past life experience, including the dreamlike experiences of the between states traversed from death to birth. Tibet's present plight. In spite of some neglect of its material progress, Tibet developed during its modern period into a relatively happy land. Tibetan society was organized to maximize the individual's potential for inner development, economic pressure was mild, and conflict within and warfare without were rare. However, it was still far from a perfected Buddhaland. In modern geopolitical terms, it became highly vulnerable during our century as a result of one positive quality and one negative quality. Positively, it was long demilitarized and therefore no match for the modern armies, first of the British and eventually of the Chinese. Negatively, it had become too isolated from other nations, locking them out as Buddhism disappeared from them. Consequently, the only two nations with a little knowledge of Tibet, the British and the Chinese, were able to misrepresent Tibet to the rest of the world in any way that suited their immediate need. When the British wanted to enact trade agreements with the sovereign Tibetan government, they dealt with Tibet as the independent nation that it was. Meanwhile, they let the world at large think of Tibet as under China, to keep the Russians out, and to keep the Chinese happy, pleased for the British to retain possession of Hong Kong and its valuable trade opportunities. The Chinese likewise knew very well they did not control Tibet, that Tibetans had no sense of being Chinese, and that no Chinese person had ever had the slightest feeling that any Tibetan was a kind of Chinese. Meanwhile, they still pretended to the world that they owned Tibet, which they call Shitsang, the Western treasury, that it had always been a part of China. Thus, when the Maoist government invaded Tibet in 1949, they told the world they were liberating their own country's Tibetan province from foreigners. There were half a dozen Europeans in Tibet. But since Tibetans considered the Chinese to be foreigners, they resisted being liberated to the death. The full force of the Red Army overwhelmed the Buddhist Tibetans, and the Chinese occupation ever since has only endured by brute force. Over 1 million Tibetans have died unnaturally, and the entire Buddhist culture has been shattered. Not a single Tibetan does not dream and pray to be free and independent of the invaders. In order to transform Tibet into a part of China, the Chinese have attempted to suppress the Tibetan language, Buddhism and the culture based on it, and all vestiges of Tibetan national identity. Such a project is doomed to failure, as the Tibetans simply cannot make themselves into Chinese. Therefore, the attempt to make Tibetans into Chinese ends up killing off the Tibetans. Fortunately, during this time His Holiness the 14th Dalai Lama has succeeded in maintaining a healthy community in exile, with the patronage of the government of India. And there is a hope that the nations of the world, if they learn about Tibet in time, will not let the genocide of the 6 million Tibetans be completed in the 1990s. Buddhism in summary. What is Buddhism? This great book of natural liberation through understanding and the between will be supposed by readers to be a Buddhist approach to death and dying. But if it were merely Buddhist, it would be relevant only for Buddhists. There would be no point in translating it for the general public. The long-standing Western interest in this Book of the Dead would be inexplicable. But only one aspect of the Book of Natural Liberation is religious in the usual sense, that is, concerned with a particular system of belief. For that matter, only one aspect of Buddhism itself is religious. Buddhism is a teaching originated by Shakyamuni Buddha about 2500 years ago. It is not based on, or a reform of, any religion existing in ancient Indian culture. Nor was it based on a revelation received from any sort of deity. The Buddha flatly rejected the contemporary Indian form of the religious belief in an omnipotent world creator. He did not believe in God as Westerners understand God. To many Westerners, he would appear an atheist, although he did accept the presence of non-omnipotent superhuman beings he called gods. He did not even consider belief or faith an end in itself, as many religious people do, although he accepted reasonable beliefs as practically useful to people. He encouraged people to question authority and use their power of reason, and not to accept irrational traditions. In his personal quest of truth, he was often quite unreligious. Shakyamuni was called a Buddha, an awakened or enlightened person, because he claimed to have achieved a perfect understanding of the nature and structure of reality. After a normal education as a warrior prince of his era, he devoted 6 years of concentrated study, yogic discipline, and meditative contemplation to the quest for reality. He considered the human mind capable of reaching a full understanding of everything, given enough native ability, the correct education, and heroic effort. Having reached that full understanding himself during his 35th year, he felt that other humans would also be able to achieve it. He dedicated the next 45 years to teaching all kinds of people. History records that large numbers of his contemporaries did succeed in reaching high levels of realization. They formed a broad-based movement that gradually spread through the countries of the Indian subcontinent and eventually throughout most of Asia. This movement often did have a religious dimension, but it had equally important social and intellectual dimensions. The Buddha used the Sanskrit word dharma to designate his truth or teaching. In the process, he added a new dimension of meaning to the word. Dharma was derived from the verb idr, to hold, and had a range of important meanings associated with holding. It could mean a distinct phenomenon, one that held a particular character, or also the particular character itself. It could mean a custom, duty, or law that held human behavior in a particular pattern. It could also mean religion, in the sense of a held pattern of belief and ritual. But the core of the Buddha's discovery was the essential reality of freedom that underlying the lived reality of existence is the immediacy of total freedom, especially freedom from suffering, from bondage, from ignorance. This essential freedom can be realized by the human mind as its own deepest and most true condition. This realization makes it possible for freedom to prevail over the habitual suffering of personal experience. So the realized individual is thenceforth held apart from suffering, not held in anything, but held out of binding patterns. Thus the new range of meanings of dharma concerned being held away from suffering. Dharma came to mean the teaching, the path of practice of the teaching, the virtue of that practice, the reality or truth taught in that teaching, and the freedom of that reality or truth, nirvana itself. This dharma as teaching is divided into 2 branches. The textual dharma and the experiential dharma, the teaching and its practice. Each of those is in turn divided into 3. The textual into 3 types of verbal teachings, the discipline, discourse, and clear science collections, and the experiential into 3 types of higher learning, the ethical, meditational, and wisdom higher educations. The Buddha taught the Dharma far and wide throughout India for over 45 years. Numerous people found his teachings beneficial, and they began to form a new community within the old society. This new community was called the Sangha, simply the community, and it formed around a new institution at its core, a monastic order of monks and nuns. Before Buddha, there had been wandering ascetics and hermits in India, but he was the first to organize suburban communities of settled monastics. The community became very important in the history of Buddhism, as it was the protective structure around the individual who followed the Buddha's example and educated him or herself in the teachings. These three main aspects of Buddhism, the Buddha, the Dharma, and the Sangha teacher, teaching, and community, came to be known as the Three Jewels, SKT. Triratna, of Buddhism, that is, the three most precious things for the individual seeking liberation from ignorance and suffering. Through the millennia since its founding, people have been considered Buddhists when they take refuge in these three jewels. They take refuge by trying to follow the Buddha's example and teachings, trying to understand the Dharma, and becoming a member of the Sangha. Thus, the Buddha founded an educational movement that developed historically on three levels: the social, and so, inevitably, political, the religious, and the philosophical or scientific. The essence of all three movements lay in his realization of the relativity and interdependence of all things, mental as well as physical. Rather than a founder of a religion, he was primarily a critic of religion. He critiqued its absolutist tendencies, its devaluation of human reason, and its legitimation of unreasonable, arbitrary, and oppressive structures of authority. Reality, as Buddha saw it, is beyond dogmatic theories, while freely open to unprejudiced experience. The human life form is extremely well adapted to reality and is extremely close to full understanding of it, which, when attained, results in an extraordinary liberation and happiness. During the Buddha's time, there were many views of the nature of life, ranging from spiritualistic soul theories embedded in elaborate theistic belief systems to a strikingly modern, materialistic nihilism. The Buddha rejected all absolute soul theories, postulations of a rigidly fixed identity or static personal essence, with his cardinal doctrine of selflessness, or soullessness, and Atma. He taught that the psychological habit of assuming a fixed subjectivity, an unchanging identity, was a key obstacle to a good life. But the Buddha never rejected the relative presence of a living self. He insisted on the continuity of the changeable, fluid soul from life to life. He explicitly rejected the contemporary nihilism that reduced even the relative, conventional, lived soul, self, or identity to a random epiphenomenon of matter. He insisted on the relative self's reality, vulnerability, responsibility, and evolutionary potential. In fact, his teaching of the universal relativity of the self opened up a widely popular vision of a vast interconnectedness of the individual with the boundless forms of life. This vision of inevitable interconnectedness inspired the popular determination in Buddhist societies for persons consciously to evolve toward realizing their highest potential and transforming the whole world into a positive environment. The universal vehicle, Mahayana, Buddhist scriptures, which became popular in India about 4 centuries after the Buddha's time, teach that a Buddha is a cosmic being whose state of achievement can be described as consisting of 3 bodies. First, a Buddha's perfect wisdom becomes a truth body, a body of ultimate reality, in that an enlightened being experiences the whole universe as one with his or her own being. Second, a Buddha's perfect compassion becomes a form body, a limitless embodiment that reaches out from the enlightened being's blissful oneness with the ultimate reality of freedom to help countless other beings escape from suffering by realizing their own oneness with freedom. This form body is itself divided into two. There is a beatific body, which is a sort of subtler ethereal body, made of a Buddha's sheer joy at being free of suffering, at having realized the absolute nature of reality. It is as infinite as reality, a subtle radiant omnipresence of a Buddha's joy throughout all things. Then there is an emanation body, which arises out of the background energy of the beatific body when a Buddha wishes to interact with ordinary beings who cannot perceive the beatific presence around them, who feel suffering and alienation. Buddhas emanate magically create whatever gross embodiments are appropriate to relate to beings, to liberate them from their suffering, and ultimately to inspire them to discover their own enlightenment and their own beatitude. Shakyamuni Buddha, the historical Buddha, is an emanation body Buddha. But the Buddha who emanated himself as Shakyamuni is believed to have an inexhaustible power to emanate himself in infinite other forms, according to the needs of beings. Thus, all Buddhas are understood to have these three bodies: truth, beatific, and emanation. These categories provide a useful framework for us to understand the Tibetan sense of the inconceivable reality and presence of enlightened beings. The Buddha taught that humans should investigate the relative world of material and mental nature in order to understand it thoroughly and improve the lives of all beings. They should investigate not only through their senses, but also through an intensified use of the subjective human mind itself, using reason and introspection, and cultivating critical thought and focused concentration to degrees of acuity unimaginable to the normal, untrained individual. The Buddha founded and greatly furthered the tradition of inner mind science, Adhyatmavidya. It is called science because it is an organized discipline for seeking knowledge of the mind in an exact manner, with a view to freeing individuals from its negative potentials and enabling them to realize its positive potentials. The Buddha set up lifelong educational and research institutions, which eventually developed into what came to be called monasteries and convents. These institutions, dedicated to higher education, spread widely throughout India and the rest of Asia over the centuries after Buddha's time. They became a permanent presence in all Asian societies until the advent of either Islam or international secularism wiped them out. The study of the death, between, and rebirth processes in particular was conducted by researchers within these mind science institutions, the results being contained in a huge cumulative scientific literature on the subject. This scientific literature on death is unique in world civilizations. It is the ultimate source of the natural liberation. Tibetan ideas about death. The Tibetan attitude toward death and the between is neither mystical nor mysterious. This guidebook for the journey through the between shows how the reality of death fits into the Tibetan's world, vividly picturing the continuity between former, present, and future lives. Their multi-life perspective is no more, and no less, a religious belief system than our modern sense of the structure of the solar system, or of the pattern of the cycle of seasons in a year. Tibetans considered it a matter of common sense and scientific fact that animate beings exist along a continuum of lives, and that the death, between, and rebirth processes follow a predictable pattern. They have credible accounts by enlightened voyagers who have gone through the between experience consciously, preserved the memory, and reported their experiences. Tibetans accept these reports of their psychonauts just as we do those of astronauts who report what happened on the moon. Tibetans also believe that most people can recover memories of their former lives by a fairly elementary regime of meditation. Tibetans act on this Buddhist perspective in a practical manner, using their lifetimes to educate themselves to understand the world and to prepare for death and future lives by improving their ethical actions, emotional habits, and critical insight. Tibetans share our Western view of death in some ways, and in other ways see death very differently. On a human level, they see it as we do, as a tragedy at the end of life. They have methods for anticipating and warding off untimely death, for cheating even timely death, and for prolonging the precious human life. On this human level, they are even more afraid of death than we modern materialists or humanists, who expect an automatic painless oblivion. Tibetans see an anesthetic oblivion as very improbable, understanding death rather as a door to a transition that can be worse than fatally dangerous for those unprepared or badly misdirected by negative habits and attitudes. They thus naturally see death as a malevolent, powerful nihility that is lurking out there, that will come for them at any time. In harmony with their inheritance from India, they envision this terror as the ferocious, terrifying god of death, Yama, king of the underworld and judge of the dead. He is portrayed as blue-black in color, with a buffalo head and 2 arms, holding a white spinal column and skull club and a noose, phallus erect, standing naked on the back of a fire-breathing buffalo. He is sometimes with his consort, the fearsome Chamunda, who can also be considered a female personification of his energy. He has numberless hordes of minions who do his bidding and roam around collecting the souls of the dying. When he comes to call, a person cannot say no, they must go with him down to the underworld. And there in his iron hall that is windowless and doorless, their good and evil deeds are weighed in the balance. Yama judges them and then sends them on to the various heavenly realms if their virtue predominates, to the animal and hellish realms if their sins predominate. If they are most fortunate and their virtue includes great sensitivity, generosity, and intelligence, they will be able to return to the human realm, which is considered better than heaven for spiritual practice. Tibetans are terrified of Yama, and they look to the Buddhas and Bodhisattvas to save them from judgment at his hands. They dramatize his presence at festivals and masquerades as a fierce deity who is danced by a giant monk wearing a terrifying mask and a colorful costume. He is always shown as ultimately tamed by the Buddha, by the wisdom bodhisattva Manjushri, or by the compassion bodhisattva Avalokiteshvara, in his form of Padmasambhava, the great adept and first historical savior of Tibet. Though the personification of death is vivid in the Tibetan imagination, we notice at once that it is not Yama himself that is so awful, but rather his judgment and the possibly negative fate he metes out. Tibetans have the common sense view that life is boundless, that we did not come out of nothing and cannot become nothing. We are both beginningless and endless. Since we will always be involved in the relational realm, we must know our inner freedom as well. If we do not, and are forced in our ignorance to experience our inevitable involvement as an endless bondage, as a perpetual suffering, our lives will be boundless torment. Human life is characterized as being midway between states of excessive pain and states of excessive pleasure. A being assumes human rebirth from life in other forms by accumulating a vast amount of merit through deeds of giving, moral interacting, and tolerating, and an equally vast amount of intelligence through long efforts of developing critical wisdom and penetrating concentration. The human form is relatively free of rigidly programmed instinctual reactions. Thus, human beings are uniquely endowed with the ability and opportunity to understand fully their situation, reprogram themselves completely positively, attain the unexcelled perfect enlightenment of Buddhahood, and become boundlessly happy, alive, radiant, and helpful to other beings. To die unenlightened and lose the liberty and opportunity of human embodiment before attaining enlightenment, and then to be reborn involuntarily in extremely miserable conditions, innumerable further times, this would be the ultimate tragedy. Once human life is understood as providing the liberty and opportunity for evolutionary freedom and altruistic enlightenment, its loss is far worse than is the loss of life assumed to be either sheer obliteration into nothingness or secure passage to heaven. It is something like expecting loss of life to result in a passage into hell or purgatory. This is a danger that is more than fatal. It is a doorway to nearly limitless torment. Thus, the Tibetan sense of the beginningless and boundless nature of life, of beings as endlessly reborn, does not palliate the fear of death at all. It lends an intensity to this life that is quite compelling. It is what really underlies the strong religiosity and spirituality of the Tibetans, which does not come from their environment of highland wastes and snowy mountains. On the more spiritual level, however, Tibetans have learned to view the ordinarily fearsome death as a strong force close to life, a powerful impulse to the good, an intensifier of positive attitudes and actions. They tend not to get caught in the reification of death as a force of pure evil, some sort of radical, insensate, arbitrary malevolence. They rather learn to see it as non-existent, as a thing in itself apart from life. This sense of the relationality of even death encourages them to view death on the highest level as the immediate omnipresent realm of freedom, not merely part of life but the ground of life. Tibetans observe that anyone can die at any time in any place. Our sense of the concreteness of the life situation, of the solidity of the waking world of the five senses and their objects, is a complete error. Nothing that we think we are, do, feel, or have has any essence, substance, stability, or solidity. All the some things in and around us with which we preoccupy ourselves from morning to night are potentially nothing to us. If we died, they would dissolve in our tightest grasp, forgotten if they were in our mind, lost if they were in our hand, faded into blank numbness if they were our mind and body. Surprisingly, once we become accustomed to the omnipresent possibility of death and life, we feel greatly liberated. We realize we are essentially free at all times in all situations. We realize that all compulsion is only based on the illusion of substantial continuation, enduring substance, binding essence. We become completely immersed in the medium of freedom. Our participation in relationalities is, in reality, totally voluntary. This sense of the immediacy of freedom is exhilarating. This higher understanding of death is associated with Yamantaka, the terminator of death, who is the most terrifying personification of the wisdom of selflessness, the realization of the emptiness of nothingness. People have noticed that Tibetan culture is highly colorful, that the Tibetans are on the whole a cheerful, vibrant, and lively lot. They are individualistic and unpredictable. They cherish freedom in all respects and on all levels. They have used their independence to practice the enlightenment teaching of the Buddha, not just to develop materially or militarily. They have lived intelligently by their lights, have used human life well, and extracted its fullest potential for evolutionary, not just material, progress. A great measure of the unique beauty of their civilization comes from their vivid awareness of the immediacy of death and the freedom that awareness brings. Chapter 2. The Tibetan Science of Death. What is death? What is death? The question is a scientific one. Western science holds that a flat line on the EEG means cessation of heartbeat and brain activity, and therefore represents death. The illusion of the subjective I in the individual consciousness, assumed by materialists to correspond with the presence of brainwave activity, should cease with the cessation of brainwaves. Yet the picture of death as a nothing in consciousness is not a scientific finding. It is a conceptual notion. There are many cases of people being revived after flatlining for some time, and they report intense subjective experiences. In the popular imagination developed by a modern scientific education, death is most often supposed to be a terminal state, a nothingness, an oblivion, a void that destroys life, that swallows it up forever. It is aligned with sleep, darkness, and unconsciousness. It is feared by those who feel happy or feel they should be happy. It is sought after by those who are in misery, filled with unbearable pain and anguish, as a blessed final anesthesia. But science should not neglect to question this picture. In fact, inner science begins with the analysis of nothingness. Nothing is after all just nothing. It cannot be a place that resembles an idea of nothingness. A place involves area or extension. It is defined by coordinates and boundaries. It is not nothing. It is room. Nothing has no room, nor can anything be located within nothing. Nothing cannot have an inside or an outside. It cannot destroy, swallow, or terminate. As nothing, it can have no energy or effect. As nothing, it cannot be a thing, a realm, a state, or anything. It is absolutely nothing to fear. It is nothing to hope for. This ultimate end of everything, this diametric opposite of all, is nothing in itself. And yet we think of nothing as something. Clearly, nothing is that conceptual entity that shows most clearly the illusory status of all conceptual entities. To use the verb exist about it is a misuse of language. To refer to nothing as it, this, that, or whatever, without quotes, is a mistake, as only the concept can be referred to. Nothing is categorically unimaginable, so it is incorrect to picture nothing as a destination. It is wrongly imagined to be a ground state giving off no reading, which appears as an EEG flatline. It is incoherently imagined to be an anesthesia following the loss of all sensation. It is wrongly conceived to be a place of quiet within which consciousness can slip. It cannot be entered. When we do imagine nothing in the above ways, we are actually doing nothing more than comforting ourselves. We are building our image of the state of nothingness on our habitual sense of deep sleep. We lose concerns, worries, sensations, and finally consciousness itself as we fall asleep. We fall asleep, having a sense of relaxing into a ground state. We may have a last moment of awareness of slipping away. We may have a first moment of waking up, complete with a memory of having been in a dream, or, less easily, of waking up in a dream or losing consciousness out of a dream. But we do not have any direct experience of being unconscious, so we cannot remember having been unconscious. Thus our sense of having rested in a state of nothingness of consciousness is an inference based on the last and first moments of threshold awareness. We associate sleep with refreshment, rest, peace, and quiet. Someone with a mental or physical sickness who cannot sleep is considered to suffer torture, and sleep deprivation will destroy anyone's body before too long. We love sleep. Actually, sleep does not correspond with a flatline, absolute lack of brain activity. Our brains can be more active during dreaming than in some waking states. Sleep is thus materialistically very different from the death state of a corpse. When we imagine death as entry into nothingness, we are merely comforting ourselves. Our sense of death as a sleep is a mere analogy even from a materialistic perspective. It is also likely that the dualistic model of liberation that motivates individual vehicle Buddhism and mystical forms of Hinduism, Taoism, and Western monotheism, a model of liberation as a state of absolute aloofness from the world of life, is derived from this universal human experience of sleep. In most cultures, sleep is accepted as a blissful withdrawal into an aloof state of peace, a restful separation from troubles, worries, pains, and entanglements. So religious ideals of nirvana, conceived as a state apart, ultimate liberation from pain and sorrows, or a supreme release, may be nothing but guaranteed states of permanent, gloriously unconscious sleep. When we see this equation, we can understand at once why materialists scoff at spiritual or religious forms of liberation. Why would they need it? They have already guaranteed themselves permanent rest. They have a guaranteed nothingness waiting for them, attained without the slightest effort on their part, without ethical sacrifice, without realization, without developing any skill or knowledge. All they have to do is fall asleep, a skill they have already cultivated during thousands of nights. But what is it that provides them the guarantee of a restful nothing awaiting them after death? Do they have any credible evidence? No one has ever returned to report entry into nothingness. They have no recorder, no viewer, no extension of their senses into the subjectivity of a dead person. They cannot physically probe into the brain-dead state of any being. They have no convincing description of nothingness, which obviously has no attributes. They have never observed even one material thing become nothing. Why should the energy or reality of a state of awareness, be it even a minimal awareness of pure rest, be the exception to the law of physics that energy is conserved and only transformed? What makes the materialists believe so powerfully in the nothingness of that one energy continuum? The answer is, obviously, that they have no grounds at all for this belief. It is merely a belief based on brave assertion, corroborated by many other believers, all without a shred of evidence, reinforced by constant repetition and dogmatic insistence. It provides ultimate comfort, satisfying the religious urge to have a complete sense of reality. This comfortingness might give rise to suspicion or doubt, so it is disguised for the materialist by the pretense that nothingness is something frightening, something undesirable, a bitter pill that he or she, the brave modern human grown up, has learned to swallow. This is why materialist scientists are so dogmatically dismissive of evidence about the post-death continuity of consciousness. They cannot consider the evidence even casually, because this would generate questions about their own belief. Like any religious dogmatism, since it is a logically weak belief, often admittedly irrational, based on no credible evidence, it cannot allow even the slightest questioning, for fear that the resulting doubt could not be withstood. In fact, A considerable body of credible evidence supports the probability of post-death existence of consciousness and sentient future life continuity. First, it is the natural thing to expect, since everything else in nature exhibits continuity through changes. Second, many credible witnesses report that they died and experienced certain adventures. Some died clinically and were revived. Some remember as children details and circumstances of former lives, and some of their memories are corroborated by other people, standing up to the investigation of reputable researchers. Some codify the data collected in various ways and presented in manuals and traditions of dying used in many cultures. And the majority of humans in most civilizations feel they must have some concern for the state of their awareness in the future lives they will be obliged to face. No sane person fears nothingness. It might be boring. It might not be delightful. But at least it should be restful, peaceful, and painless. And relative to all the troubles of wakefulness, it is pleasant and much sought after by every one of us. What we do fear, and should fear rationally, are pain and suffering. We work hard in life to avoid pain and suffering for ourselves and those dear to us. So we are afraid of death, not because we know it is nothing, but because we know in our bones it cannot automatically bring us nothing. We fear the many painful somethings it might bring us. So our sensible human caution wants to know what it will bring, how we can prepare to avoid the bad and gain the good, what to expect, and how to prepare for it. We know that falling asleep tonight will not prevent tomorrow and its challenges. So we prepare for tomorrow as best we can. The better we are prepared, the more happily we fall asleep. We know that the sleep of death will not automatically prevent new situations for consciousness. So we prepare for those new situations. And the better prepared we are, the more relaxed we will be when we have to die. For even the most diehard materialist, Pascal's famous wager is still compelling. If we become nothing after death, we will not be there to regret having prepared for something. But if we are something after death, and we have not prepared at all, or are badly prepared, then we will long feel bitter, painful regret. So we have everything to lose by not preparing, and nothing to gain. We have everything to gain by preparing, and nothing to lose. Should our preparation be for nothing, a little time spent on it in this life will not be regretted for eternity. Should our preparation be for something, the time taken away from it for the sake of this life's business or pleasure will be deeply regretted for eternity as the waste of a vital resource. So, those of us who have either the prudence or the adventuresomeness to deal with a life situation of total relativity in space and time can safely proceed. There are no boundaries to our interconnectedness with limitless dimensions and universes. And there are no limits to our continuity of development, bad or good. A very powerful commitment to ameliorate the situations in which we find ourselves, along with others, arises from the understanding of the inevitability of being situated in infinite relativity and continuity. The abandonment of any reification of nothingness leaves us with an absolute preoccupation with the quality of relative situations. This preoccupation demands that we use every means at our disposal to improve them. To fall back on particular religious beliefs supported by no rational evidence or plausible inference is not sensible, given the fact that our choices of actions might have unlimited consequences. Having cured ourselves of the temptation to reify nothingness, Why would we reifice some improbable soul state that reproduces the characteristics of a pleasant nothingness of blissful anesthesia, aloofness from connection to conditions, permanent isolation from experience, and all guaranteed by an absolute non-relative power that controls the relative, yet is unaffected by it? Here, rather, we should use Pascal's wager in reverse. If, due to an inevitable destiny of soul, an omnipotent being will save us no matter what we do, we will not regret having spent a bit of time preparing unnecessarily to save ourselves. But if there is no such being, or if there are divine beings more powerful than us who can help us if we are prepared to accept their help, then we will deeply regret for a very long time our failure to prepare ourselves. There is no reason for a sound faith to be irrational. A useful faith should not be blind, but should be well aware of its grounds. A sound faith should be able to use scientific investigation to strengthen itself. It should be open enough to the spirit not to lock itself up in the letter. A nourishing, useful, healthful faith should be no obstacle to developing a science of death. In developing such a science, it behooves the investigator to consider all previous attempts to do so, especially those traditions with a long development and a copious literature. Of all these, the science of death preserved in the Indo-Tibetan tradition is perhaps the most copious of all. Given the boundless interconnectedness of living forms, beginningless and endless, and spread throughout an infinity of space, the materialist picture of evolution as natural selection operating purposelessly, yet efficiently developing life forms through random mutation from a definite beginning point within a finite theater of planetary environment, needs some revision. First of all, postulated definite beginnings and finite settings are always suspect. The materialist account describes reasonably the material, causal development process, but why should not mind as well as body develop and mutate? The Buddhist view of all this, the psychobiological evolutionary account known as the theory of karma, is very like the Darwinian idea of evolution. The karma theory describes a great chain of being postulating a kinship between all observed species of beings and a pattern of development of one life form into another. Humans have been monkeys in the past, and all animals have been single-celled animals. The difference in the karma theory is that individuals mutate through different life forms from life to life. A subtle mental level of life carries patterns developed in one life into the succeeding ones. Species develop and mutate in relation to their environments, and individuals also develop and mutate from species to species. This karmic evolution can be random, and beings can evolve into lower forms as well as higher ones. Once beings become conscious of the process, however, they can purposively affect their evolution through choices of actions and thoughts. Although there are undeniable differences, the karma theory gives an evolutionary explanation of how beings are the way they are. So I have translated karma throughout as evolution or evolutionary action. Karma means action that causes development and change, and so is close to what we mean by evolution. There is no need to retain the Indian word karma. Some translators do so because of a factor of mystification. They feel that nothing in the target language can reproduce the unique meaning of the original term. Some Westerners who delve into Eastern thought also keep the term because they are thinking of karma mystically, as a kind of fate. But in Buddhist science, it has nothing to do with fate. It is an impersonal, natural process of cause and effect. Our karma at a given moment of life or death or the between is the overall pattern of causal impulses resulting from former actions connected with our life continuum. These form a complex that impresses its effects on our bodies, actions, and thoughts. In turn, our ongoing actions of body, speech, and mind form new causal impulses, which determine the nature and quality of our lives in the future. This complex can be called our evolutionary momentum. There is an old Tibetan saying, "Don't wonder about your former lives, just look carefully at your present body. Don't wonder about your future lives, just look at your mind in the present." This expresses the sense that our present body has evolved from a long evolution driven by former actions, and our future embodiments will be shaped by how we think and what we decide to do in our present actions. The time of the between, the transition from a death to a new rebirth, is the best time to attempt consciously to affect the causal process of evolution for the better. Our evolutionary momentum is temporarily fluid during the between, so we can gain or lose a lot of ground during its crises. Tibetans are highly aware of this. It is why they treasure the Book of Natural Liberation so much as a guide to bettering their fate. The 6 realms. Buddhists have schematized the possible life realms into 6 main categories. Negative possible experiences can increase limitlessly, leading to forms and embodiments of experience that are utterly hellish, as those realms have been imagined by Eastern as well as Western imaginations. Buddhists have developed elaborate pictures of the 8 hot hells, the 8 cold hells, the 8 crushing hells, and the 8 cutting hells, moving out imaginatively from the painful experiences of heat, cold, compression, and dissection. There are mentally excruciating hell depictions as well, infinite in their terrifying variety and experiential negativity. These hells are produced by negative evolutionary actions driven predominantly by hate. They are the feedback constructions and magnifications of limitless continua of hate. Fortunately, no sojourn in hell can logically be eternal, though they seem of infinite duration to the agonized sufferer in them. I have called the beings in these realms hell beings. Next there are the realms of the pretans, often called hungry ghost realms. Pretans are certainly hungry and thirsty, but they are not ghosts. They are considered living beings caught in realms of extreme frustration. I have anglicized their Indian name Preta and call them pretans. Greed, the desire to incorporate, is magnified and fed back to produce the pretan realms, just as hate creates the hells. Pretans undergo infinite permutations of the tortures of Tantalus. Some have giant stomachs the size of Yankee Stadium, narrow throats miles long and the diameter of pinholes, and insatiable hunger and thirst. When they find something resembling food, it is hard to get, hard to eat and swallow, and it burns on its way down and creates inconceivable pain instead of giving satisfaction. Pretans are incarnations of hunger, thirst, craving, and frustration. As the hell beings are incarnations of hate and the pretans of greed, animal life forms are created by accumulated ignorance, folly, or stupidity. Animals are more familiar to us, being close to the human life form. They suffer from relative lack of intelligence and limited ability to communicate. They are bound mainly to involuntary, instinct-driven reactions to situations. Their potential for freedom is extremely limited. They are not looked down on by Buddhists as intrinsically inferior to humans. They also have souls, they also suffer, and they also will attain enlightenment. But their situation is not well suited to intensive positive development due to the fixity of their instinctual ignorance. They need a special kind of care and assistance to help them evolve, care that a human must almost become a Buddha to provide effectively. Humans, in their realm nearby the animals, are also incarnations of all the negativities, but have become free of the extremes of hate, greed, and ignorance that bind the hell beings, pretans, and animals. The human life form is the evolutionary product not only of these negativities, but also of their opposites, patience, generosity, and intelligent sensitivity. Over long evolutionary periods prior to taking life as a human, over billions of lifetimes, infinitesimal quanta of patience have diminished the force of hell-producing hate, arising in the form of slight decreases of hate reactions at being hurt. Infinitesimal quanta of detachment or generosity have diminished the force of pretan-producing greed, arising as slight decreases of attachment reactions to habitual objects of desire. And both tolerance and generosity are stimulated by infinitesimal quanta of heightened sensitivity to other beings, which counteracts the self-centered delusions that dominate the animal existence and arise as slight decreases in self-preoccupied absorption and the pursuit of instinctual programs, and hence in momentary noticings of the needs of other animals. The cumulative effect of these tiny voluntary they have freedom and opportunity beyond that of the human being. Indeed, they have risen to their estate from the human level, usually, but they have invested their generosity, tolerance, and sensitivity in the pursuit of power. They have been caught in the thrall of competitiveness and are driven by jealousy. They want to outdo other beings. They love to fight. They live in heaven-like realms near the heavens, and they are constantly trying to compete with the gods, attempting to take the heaven realms away from them. Since their lives of constant fighting and killing and dying habituate them to rage, they tend eventually to fall down into the hells. The highest egocentric life forms in terms of sheer merit and intelligence are those of the gods. Due to their long evolutionary practice of generosity, sensitivity, and tolerance, coupled with their mastery of mind control, they ascended from the human life form through various paradises. They have more freedom and opportunity than humans, but the very richness of their endowment is their greatest danger. They feel so great and grand, they have such comforts, pleasures, powers, and glories, their lifespans are so long, and the lower realms and the possible sufferings of egocentric lives seem so far away from them that it is very hard for them to use their freedom creatively. They are dominated by pride and tend to fall back below the human level when their extremely long lives lose the evolutionary momentum that created them. There are three regions within the God realm: the desire, pure form, and formless regions. The desire region consists of 6 heavens, 2 of them terrestrial though invisible to humans, and 4 celestial heavens that still have a kind of landscape for the deities within them. The deities of these heavens experience a paradisiacal existence, but as a result they lose the drive for ultimate freedom and happiness in a seemingly never-ending round of high-quality pleasures. Above the 6 desire heavens are the 16 pure form heavens, within which deities exist in bodies of pure energy. They are said to be Brahma-bodied, meaning they are like transgalactic energy clouds of bliss and brilliance. Their self-delight is their chief failing, and though they have vast intelligence, they tend to ignore the memory of their past as weaker, suffering beings Their sense of the plight of infinite other beings around them throughout the multiverse, and the possibility of their future vulnerability. Beyond these pure form heavens, though the spatial term beyond loses meaningfulness here, are the four formless heavens, those of infinite space, infinite consciousness, absolute nothingness, and beyond consciousness and unconsciousness. In these heavens dwell countless trillions of gods who have withdrawn from involvement in forms, driven by the pursuit of the absolute. Aiming at the ever more peaceful, the ever more subtle, and the ever more real, they are not safeguarded by the critical awareness of the constructedness of all states, their emptiness and relativity. They remain within realms of dead calm for extremely long periods of time, untroubled by any concern, secure in their sense of having achieved final ultimacy, of having become one with the absolute. They are most subtly locked by pride and delusion into the ultimate self-constructed world of alienation and self-preoccupation imaginable. Buddhists consider these heavens and the life forms of the gods to be the most dangerous pitfall for meditators, because they are so close to what the philosophically uneducated expect the absolute to be. An infinite objectivity, an infinite subjectivity, nothingness, and an infinite indefinability. Only the understanding of voidness, the relativity of all things and states, provides the critical defense against succumbing to the apparent calm and transcendentality of these heavens and becoming reborn there for a very long time. The 6 realms of migration are graphically represented everywhere throughout Tibet and elsewhere in the Buddhist world, in the Wheel of Life often found on temple walls. This figure represents the experience of the dying person, who flies into the mouth of death, the deity Yama, holding the wheel in mouth and hands and feet, and lands on the wheel of egocentric life, according to his or her evolutionary momentum. See color insert, plate 4. The Book of Natural Liberation presupposes this cosmological context as the setting for the deceased person's journey through the between. Once one has felt the boundless interconnectedness of all life forms, the inspiring infinite horizon of positive evolution toward Buddhahood is accompanied by the terrifying infinite horizon of negative evolution or degeneration toward the animal, pretan, or hell-being life forms. The horrid states are truly frightening and definitely to be avoided. Nothingness would be far preferable. Awareness of the possible horrid states is a powerful motivator toward positive development for oneself and an intense catalyst for compassion for others. It is indispensable for developing the machinic drive to save other beings from suffering that is called the will to, or spirit of, enlightenment. This is the spiritual conception that changes an ordinary egocentric being into an altruistic bodhisattva. Some Asian teachers have said in recent decades that the horrid states are simply metaphorical and not to be taken literally, that they merely indicate states of mind to be avoided. There is some truth to that, of course, especially since the whole universe also consists of states of mind. It was also practical of those teachers in that their students, Westerners with a certain background and education, might have been frightened away from an edifying path of learning and meditation by the prospect of the crackling brimstone fires of hell they thought they had long ago escaped. But in the final analysis, the metaphorical approach is misleading, and it no longer is quite so necessary. All the world is in some sense created by the mind, from the infinitely positive to the infinitely negative. If you step out in front of a freight train, its painful crushing of you is all in the mind as well. A liberated person, viscerally aware of the precise sense of just being in the mind, would have no problem standing in front of such a train if there were any benefit for beings from doing so. But it takes a person of such ability to ignore the possibility of hell, the Pretan realm, the animal realm, or even the worse forms of human life without liberty and opportunity. It is more healthy for the rest of us to fear being crushed by freight trains. It gives us energy to get out of their way. It is healthy for us to fear letting negativities go unchecked because of the infinitely negative consequences they can produce. It gives us energy to nip negativities in the bud. If we are going to use the science of death to develop the art of dying well, we must realize that all these realms need to be considered just as real as our present lives in the human realm. Those who have remembered their own previous lives have reported this to be the case. And it makes logical sense that the life forms in the ocean of evolution would be much more numerous than just the number of species on this one tiny little material planet we can see around us nowadays. So, the encouragement provided by the "it's all in your mind" approach can be useful. But we should remember that it cannot be applied selectively to those aspects of reality we do not like. All of reality is in the mind, and the mind has us experience it as out there. So we should still take care to see to it that out there is beautiful and not horrible, to prevent the horrible and develop the beautiful. The three Buddha bodies. The six realms scheme gives a static cross-section of the ordinary Buddhist cosmos. We need also a sense of the Buddhist view of the boundless process of existence experienced by the enlightened. A soul's continuing life process endlessly goes through the phases of death state, between state, and life state. These phases are parallel within a single life to deep sleep, the dream state, and the waking state. And within the waking state there is a third parallel cycle, the deep trance state, the subtle body-mind state, a consciously directed out-of-body state, known as magic body, and the gross body re-entry state. These sets of three are connected with the standard analysis of the Buddha state into the three Buddha bodies, the truth body, the beatific body, and the emanation body. The practice of Tantric Yoga aims to align and transmute ordinary death, the sleep state, and trance into the Buddha truth body, the ordinary between, the dream state, and the waking subtle magic body-mind state into the Buddha beatific body, and ordinary life, the waking state, and the integrated gross body into the Buddha emanation body. In the context of practices such as those presented in the Book of Natural Liberation, oriented toward preparing for a successful use of the ordinary between state to accelerate progress toward Buddhahood, the processes of the sequence of lives, daily life, and the single lifetime can also be described as the six betweens: the life, dream, trance, death point, reality, and existence betweens. This scheme is used to create in the practitioner a sense that all moments of existence are between moments, unstable, fluid, and transformable into liberated enlightenment experience. Thus, the life between is normal living, understood as existing between birth and death. The dream between is the period between deep sleep and the waking state. The trance between is the state between the waking state of dualistic consciousness and the enlightened awareness of transcendent wisdom. The death point between is the momentary flash or several-day period of unconsciousness between life and the reality between. The reality between is the prolonged conscious state, sometimes as long as a fortnight, between the death point and existence betweens. The existence between is the second prolonged conscious state of the between traveler, consisting of the experiences of encountering various birthplaces in a womb, egg, moisture, or lotus. It occurs between the reality between and conception, or birth into the life between. These 6 betweens are designed to emphasize the transitional nature of all moments of existence anywhere on an individual's life continuum. The schemes of the 3 bodies and the 6 betweens are used to create a context supportive of efforts to transmute the ordinary round of suffering of persons locked into egocentric self-preoccupation into an experience of love and happiness. The body-mind complex. Having laid out the outlines of the cosmos underlying the Book of Natural Liberation, what is the Tibetan model of the body-mind complex? The Buddhist sciences put forth a number of models for different purposes. The schemes we need to understand here are those of the 3 levels of gross, subtle, and extremely subtle body and mind, the 5 aggregates, the 5 elements, and the 6 senses. Before describing them, we should bear in mind that all such schemes in Buddhist sciences are heuristic devices, patterns easy to remember. There need not absolutely be only 5 or 6 of this or that. In each case, one could analyze things into more or fewer categories. The sets used by the Tibetans are those that they have found most useful in their long experience. Conceptual schemes are like lenses in a camera. A scene with a 105mm lens looks different than it does with a 35mm lens. There is no need to argue over which is more true to what is out there. They are merely different levels of magnification. The 3 levels of the body-mind complex are used to provide a framework for Buddhist practitioners to integrate their subtle contemplative experiences with their ordinary experience. This enables them to alter their habitual self-identification process in order to enter usually unconscious states consciously. Thus, when we see something or feel a sensation, we are normally conscious only of the surface level of the experience, the tree over there or the ache in here. We are not conscious of the photons of light striking the neurons of sensitivity and the microscopic workings of the optic nerves. We are not aware of the neurotransmitter chemicals flashing signals through the central nervous system to let the brain know there is an ache in the stomach. But the Buddhist inner scientist or psychonaut seeks to become conscious of such normally unconscious processes. She thus needs the equivalent of a microscope for this inner exploration. So, she develops a subtle model of the self, with which she trains herself to identify, in order to experience directly the subtler inner processes. The body-mind complex is analyzed into 3 levels: gross, subtle, and extremely subtle. The gross body is the body of flesh, blood, bone, and other substances that can be further analyzed into the 5 main elements of earth, water, fire, wind, and space. Further analysis down to the level of modern elemental chemistry is considered too fine for this context, reaching a level of differentiation that is out of touch with the self-identifying imagination. The gross mind that corresponds to this body is the mind of the 6 sense consciousnesses, the 5 that correspond to the physical senses of the eyes, ears, nose, tongue, and body, and the 6th, mental sense consciousness that operates within the central nervous system, coordinating all the input from the senses with concepts, thoughts, images, and volitions. The subtle body roughly corresponds to what we think of as the central nervous system. It is not as much the wet-ware, brain matter, of the system as it is the pattern structuring it into a vessel of experience. The nerve channels are a structure of energy pathways that consist of thousands of fibers radiating out from 5, 6, or 7 nexi, called wheels, complexes, or lotuses, themselves strung together on a 3-channel central axis that runs from mid-brow to the tip of the genitals, via the brain crown and the base of the spine. Within this network of pathways, there are subtle drops of awareness-transmitting substances, moved around by subtle energies called winds. The subtle mind corresponding to these structures and energies consists of 3 interior states that emerge in consciousness. The instant subjective energy is withdrawn from the gross senses. These 3 are called luminance, radiance, and immanence, the deepest state of the subtle mind, and are likened to pure moonlight, pure sunlight, and pure darkness. In unenlightened persons, these 3 are mixed with normally subconscious instinctual drive patterns, called the 80 natural instincts, a long list including various types of desires, aggressions, and confusions. The extremely subtle body is called the indestructible drop. It is a tiny energy pattern existing normally only in the center of the heart-wheeler complex. The extremely subtle mind that corresponds to it is the intuition of clear light, called transparency. At this extremely subtle level, the body-mind distinction is abandoned, as the 2 are virtually inseparable. This indestructible drop transparent awareness is the Buddhist soul, the deepest seat of life and awareness, whose continuity is indestructible, though it constantly changes while moving from life to life. To achieve conscious identification with this body-mind, to experience reality from this extremely subtle level of awareness, is tantamount to attaining Buddhahood. And this is the real goal of the Book of Natural Liberation. Another important way of analyzing the gross body-mind complex is the scheme of the 5 aggregates, or processes. The material, sensational, conceptual, volitional, and consciousness processes of the individual life. The Sanskrit word for these, skandha, literally means heap. Aggregate is standard for Buddhist translations, though in some respects I prefer process indicating their dynamic quality. The first of these processes corresponds with the gross body, and the latter 4 analyze mind and its functions into conceptually and introspectively manageable levels. The original purpose of the aggregate scheme was to explore the body and mind, in order to locate that which is habitually experienced as the fixed self, to discover the unfindability of anything mental or physical, which can serve as that fixed self, and through that insight to attain liberation from bondage to the habitual sense of fixed identity. The following figure summarizes this scheme of the 5 aggregates, or processes, of the body-mind complex. In these schemes, the gross body-mind complex begins at birth and ceases at death, except for mental consciousness, which changes for the between being, since it is no longer embedded in gross matter and preoccupied with the input of the 5 physical senses. Dream consciousness is an instance in normal life of mental consciousness, operating independently of the gross physical senses. It is an important analogy or even precursor of the between consciousness. The 5 gross senses cease operating in sleep, and mental consciousness continues more subtly. During most dream experiences, mental consciousness produces out of itself a simulation of eyes and ears and even an environment, in order for the dream being to hear sounds and see sights and colors. The sense of having a body that sometimes emerges in a dream is an important analog of the sense of self of a between being. Normal people without special training rarely have such a sense. Many rarely remember dreams, almost none remember the first aerosol of the dream or the dissolving out of the dream, and very few are capable of lucid dreaming, while being aware they are dreaming, without waking up. The development of such abilities is of primary importance in developing the ability to die lucidly, to remain self-aware of what and where one is during these transitional experiences. An important first step toward the ability to die lucidly is developing a sensitivity to the transitions between these various states. The subtle body-mind schemes are designed specifically for that purpose. The subtle body scheme of channels, winds, and drops can be employed by mental consciousness in the process of unfolding special types of inner sensitivities. The channels include the 72,000 circulatory passages within the body, which are structured around a central axis of three main central channels, running from mid-brow via the crown down in front of the spine, to the tip of the sexual organ via the coccyx, with the 5 nexus wheels at brain, throat, heart, navel, and genitals. There are various pictures of these wheels and channels because the practitioner can visualize them in a variety of ways, depending on the specific inner sensibilities he is trying to unfold. The energies that flow within these channels, the subtle winds, are schematized into 5 main and 5 branch winds, which have specific bases, ranges, colors, functions, and characters. The details of this are not essential in this context. It is enough to emphasize that becoming aware of the body's functions in terms of these energies is the key technique for the processes of gaining control over the life and death functions. Finally, the drops are the awareness-transmitting substances, chemical essences associated with genetic materials. They form the base of specific consciousnesses located in specific centers at different times in different states. For example, in the Kalachakra system, there is a special system of 4 kinds of drops. Waking state drops form at brow or navel during waking activity, providing the focus of awareness or the center of the sense of self during waking experience. Dream state drops form at the throat or the base of the spine during dreaming, providing the central focus for awareness during dream experiences. Sleep state drops form in the peripheral heart center or mid-genital center to give focus to deep rest experiences. Finally, fourth state drops form deeper in the heart center or at the genital tip center, providing the focus for bliss awarenesses during advanced enlightenment or orgasmic experiences. Understanding the workings of the drops enables practitioners to focus awareness and to intensify experiences and realizations. The subtle body's wheels and channels. This depicts in general the physiology of the channels of the subtle nervous system. There is the triple central axis, with 5 or 6 or more nexi ranged along it. From these nexi energy fibers expand out all over the body, numbered as 72,000, not depicted here. Thus the self-image cultivated by the practitioner during subtle yogas is that of a sensitive, gyroscope-like structure, within which energy and awareness circulate into the subtle mind's intuitions, experiences, and instincts. The subtle mind is the subjectivity that corresponds to the subtle body patterns of channels, winds, and drops. The above figure summarizes its analysis into 3 main states, associated with 80 instinctual patterns or natures. These states occur when specific subtle physical events happen in the subtle body. The Tibetan view is that everyone has such a subtle mind, and everyone traverses these experiences. but it takes a special training to develop awareness of them, to experience them lucidly. Finally, there is the extremely subtle body-mind, where the body-mind duality itself is abandoned. This is the indestructible drop, called the energy-mind indivisible of clear light transparency. Very hard to describe or understand, and not to be misconstrued as a rigid fixed identity, the subtlest, most essential state of an individual being is beyond body-mind duality. It consists of the finest, most sensitive, alive, and intelligent energy in the universe. It is a being's deepest state of pure soul, where the being is intelligent light, alive and singular, continuous yet changing, aware of its infinite interconnection with everything. It is beyond all instinct patterns of lust, aggression, or delusion, beyond all duality, one with reality, and one with the truth body of all Buddhas. It is what is referred to by Buddha nature, and its actualization in experience is the goal of the Book of Natural Liberation. It is the key to the special method of relaxing into one's deepest natural state that is taught at the highest level in the Nyingma order of Tibetan Buddhism as the Great Perfection. See Glossary in Chapter 8. Each living being is really just this indestructible drop at the extremely subtle level. This is the living soul of every being. It is what makes the boundless process of reincarnation possible. It is the gateway into liberation, always open, essentially free, though the being evolved around it may identify itself with intensely turbulent states of suffering. It is peaceful, translucent, trouble-free, and uncreated. Knowing it is what made the Buddha smile. It is what makes Buddhas and living beings the same. This extremely subtle indestructible drop is very similar to the Hindu notion of the self, Atman, or Supreme Self, Paramatman, which is reached as the absolute negation of all petty, individual personality selves. The Buddha was never dogmatic about formulae, even about his most powerful formula known as selflessness. He emphasized selflessness when talking with absolutists, and he emphasized self when talking with nihilists. So it is not a question of early Buddhism having no self, and Tantric and Tibetan Buddhism later returning to a self. Buddha always taught a soul as what reincarnates, as a selfless continuum of relative, changing, causally engaged awareness. To get down to lucid experience of the extremely subtle indestructible drop of soul requires the full realization of voidness or selflessness. It is, in the words of the author Maitreyanatha, a supreme self of selflessness. However, the point here is not the philosophical niceties of the extremely subtle, but the clear exposition of these schemes, themselves important tools for the yoga of dying creatively. Stages of death. Now that the three levels of body and mind have been outlined, we can turn to the scheme encoding the stages of the death process. This is central in the Book of Natural Liberation, since the deceased is presumed to be traversing these stages as we are reaching out to him or her. This scheme is called the 8 stages of the dissolution process. Tibetan explorers have reported that a dying person goes through the following stages and tends to have the following experiences. Each dissolution expresses a certain sequence of subjective experiences. This model of the death process has been found by generations of yogis and yajnas, male and female practitioners of Buddhist yoga. The linking of one's life energies to one's knowledge and understanding to be extremely useful in developing understanding and control of the death transition. The first 4 stages are further elaborated by a scheme known as the 25 gross elements, in which they are associated with the 5 aggregates and with the basic wisdoms or enlightenment energies corresponding to each aggregate. Combining the first 4 of the 8 dissolutions with these 25 gross elements, we get a more complete description of the death process. When earth dissolves into water, one feels sinkingly weak and melting. The material aggregate dissolves as the body seems to shrivel. The mirror wisdom, which is the transmuted energy of delusion, dissolves as forms become indistinct. The eye sense deteriorates, and sights are blurred. Everything seems like a mirage of water down a highway. When water dissolves into fire and bodily fluids seem to dry out, sensations cease as one becomes numb. Equalizing wisdom, which is the energy of attachment, dissipates as sensations disappear. The ear sense goes, and one can no longer hear. One feels surrounded in smoke. When fire dissolves into wind and one feels cold, individuating wisdom, the energy of desire, fades as notions dim out from one's mind. Inhalation weakens and the nose cannot smell anything. One feels surrounded by a swarm of fireflies or a burst of sparks. When wind dissolves into space or consciousness and breathing stops and energy circulations withdraw into the central nervous system, volitional functions disappear, along with wonder-working wisdom, the energy of competitiveness. The tongue thickens and tastes are forgotten. The body sense fades and textures are lost. One feels enveloped in a candle flame in its last moment. The stages of death, dissolutions and experiences. From this time, one might be pronounced clinically dead. The gross physical elements have all gone, and there is no movement in brain or circulatory system. But gross consciousness, with its mind sense and its 80 instinct patterns that agitate the 3 realms of the subtle mind, dissolves only at the 5th stage. The winds that drive the 80 patterns dissolve into the central channel, and the white awareness drop, or male essence, the white spirit of enlightenment, from the brain, descends down the central channel toward the heart complex. One inwardly perceives within the mind space a vast sky full of white moonlight. Next, the red awareness drop, or female essence, the red spirit of enlightenment, rises from the genital wheel toward the heart complex. One perceives a sky full of orange sunlight. In the 7th dissolution, the stage of immanence, the 2 drops meet at the heart and enclose the consciousness. One perceives the sky full of bright dark light, or pure darkness, and then one loses consciousness. Finally, one passes into the realm of clear light translucency, gaining an unaccustomed kind of non-dualistic consciousness. The aggregates and wisdoms corresponding to the early stages of death. At this point, a key structure of ordinary life, what is known as the 6-fold knot at the heart complex, unravels. The right and left channels have tightly enclosed the heart complex center. From the moment of our conception in this life, and subsequent development of the central nervous system occurs around this 6-fold heart knot. When it unravels totally, our extremely subtle consciousness flies out of its location, driven by our evolutionary orientation. This is the real moment of death. This is the death point between. It is the subtlest state possible for a being. Anything said about it does not do it justice. Extremely subtle clear light consciousness is beyond dualities of finity and infinity, time and eternity, subject and object, self and other, consciousness and unconsciousness, even ignorance and enlightenment. It is a state so transparent that one unprepared for it will see right through it and not even notice it. One will experience the loss of consciousness in the latter part of the immanent state, and the return to the consciousness of darkness, when reversing back up through the immanent state toward re-embodiment, without any sense of having been in any other state, or feeling disoriented and uncertain, as we sometimes are when we awaken too suddenly. The whole science and art of navigating the between state bears down on this moment, assisting a person to use the transition between habitual lives to enter this extremely subtle awareness that is naturally at one with blissful freedom, total intelligence, boundless sensitivity, that is, perfect enlightenment. Many persons spend a number of days in this juncture, but often in a state of complete unconsciousness. Confusion about what has happened to them, residual unconsciousness from the stage of immanence, and terror at being cut loose in the universe prevent them from recognizing their deepest home in this clear light translucency, their spiritual oneness with the most loving, powerful, and secure beings in the universe. This is the time when the Book of Natural Liberation traditions are of greatest impact. Ideally, the deceased will have learned and practiced them before dying. Otherwise, they can be taught at the time of death, though it is unlikely that the totally untrained person can overcome the egocentric instinctual drives and the fear and terror during this high-energy crisis and achieve total liberation. Especially because of the difficulty of unraveling the sixfold heart complex knot, it must have been gradually worked on and loosened up during a person's life for its sudden loosening in the death process not to cause an overwhelmingly distracting trauma at this point. Most people traverse these dissolutions without recognizing what is happening to them, not being able to rest in the clear light, not realizing their essential freedom, happiness, and natural and joyous boundless participation in the lives of all beings. They will mentally shoot through the void's clear light and rise back up into gross embodiment through the 8 dissolutions in the reverse order. They will faint again at immanence, then rise through dark light, radiant sunlight, and luminance moonlight into instinctually dominated consciousness, then reassociate themselves with wind, fire, water, and earth, structured by the imagery they retrieve from the evolutionary patterns encoded by their own actions in their spiritual genes, the genes the individual brings from former lives. These structures will remain fluid in their dreamlike existence in mental bodies in the between state, only becoming solidified at the grossest physical level when they take rebirth in a lotus or womb or egg or moist cavity. During the between state time, due to its fluidity and the subtlety of their energy embodiment, their consciousness is magical in power and extremely intelligent, so they can make excellent use of the Book of Natural Liberation if it is read or mentally transmitted to them. Here, in the process of safeguarding the quest of a rebirth, defending beings against falling into really destructive states of existence, and guiding them into advantageous life situations, the Great Book of Natural Liberation through understanding and the between serves the magnificent purpose its author intended. During the between state, the consciousness is embodied in a ghost-like between body, made of subtle energies structured by the imagery in the mind, similar to the subtle embodiment we experience in dreams. Though subtle, it is an embodiment of consciousness. It arises through the stages of dissolution in reverse, and when the individual leaves it to enter a gross body at conception in a womb, she dissolves out of it in a kind of mini-death process. The 8 dissolution processes are followed downward from the between state embodiment into the clear light consciousness, and again upward in reverse from clear light to the new embodiment. Indeed, even when a being falls asleep, wakes up in a dream, dissolves out of a dream, and wakes up in the gross body again, These dissolution stages can be discerned, usually compressed into a rapid succession of unnoticed instantaneous phases. The meditative practices associated with between-state training are crucial for sharpening attention, so you can become aware of the process, slow down the transitions, and remain lucidly aware of the changes as they occur. It is vital to master and hold in mind these schemes, developed over the centuries in the Tibetan science of death. The reality of liberation. The science of death is the foundation of the art of dying, just as the science of medicine is the foundation of the art of healing. To use this book of natural liberation to best advantage, we must understand clearly the opportunity afforded by a conscious approach to the death process. What does liberation mean in the phrase natural liberation? What does it mean to say that the basic and ultimate reality of all things is emptiness, or freedom? What does the Book of Natural Liberation mean when it promises natural liberation, Tibetan, Rang Grol, mentioning attributes such as perfection, natural bliss, no more rebirth, and cessation of suffering? Is Buddhism after all an escapist system? Is the Book of Natural Liberation a prescription for escape? It can seem so sometimes. There is more than one idea about liberation and freedom within Buddhism. In the Buddha's original teaching of the Four Noble Truths, the third noble truth is that of nirodha, which literally means cessation, meaning cessation of suffering. Nirvana, the name for the final reality realized by an enlightened being, literally means extinguished, blown out, or gone out. The spiritual climate in Buddha's time was derived from numerous movements of ascetic intellectuals who were sick of the fettered, unenlightened life, who saw it as unendingly miserable, and who sought annihilation of mind as well as body through intense transcending samadhi. To help them, the Buddha presented the nirvana he had found in a slightly dualistic light, as if it were the final extinction they so fervently desired. He was already a Buddha, and as a Buddha was undivided from nirvana while walking and teaching all over India, still being present in some sense while transcendent in some sense. Yet, he called his eventual death parinirvana, or final nirvana, to keep up the allure of a goal beyond all life, for the strongly individualistic, dualistic seekers of freedom, conceived as obliteration. In fact, the person addicted to egocentrism, who is habitually oriented toward an isolated center of being that seems to be the real him or her, who feels aloof when up and alienated when down, who feels intuitively the correctness of I think therefore I am. That is to say, most of us does have a secret craving for oblivion. Oblivion, after all, is only the full entry into a withdrawn reality of total separation from hassles. To be sure, we expect no fun there. We may miss the few people we really care about. We may forego our few real pleasures, but at least we feel sure of no severe pain or agony. There is no unlimited horizon of danger and vulnerability. Some moderns, who most vigorously reject the suggestion that they might be emotional annihilationists, closet cosmic escapists, and who most bravely assert their existential commitment to unrelenting involvement, may dare to do so only because they basically feel secure that oblivion awaits them no matter what. Indeed, they might think they were terrified of that oblivion, thereby proving to themselves that the possibility of hell was not the issue. Among humanity as a whole, vast numbers of lemming-like people seek cessation through suicidal wars, through becoming heroin addicts, through persisting in cigarette and alcohol addiction. There is no question that annihilationism flourishes abundantly in our world. Therefore, Allowing nirvana to appear as if it were the supreme of blissful oblivions is not a useless teaching tactic. It is adroit and beneficial. Especially since it turns out that the seeker who embraces nothingness, who blasts off into the samadhi of the void, finds that what ceases is not all life, but is his or her ignorance, misknowledge, egocentric addiction, the subjective and objective self-addictions. Fortunately, liberation, the cessation of self-addiction, results in a powerful and durable happiness, a vibrant and sustaining bliss. That special overflowing of joy makes the small worldly joys previously knowable in the tight trap of self-addiction seem paltry and pathetic. And the final bonus is that this relatively ultimate bliss, this supreme beatitude of the happiness of real freedom, naturally realizes that the lack of isolated, fixed, and independent self is just equivalent to the presence of all totally interrelated things and beings, inconceivably intertwining endlessly throughout unmeasurable eternity and unencompassable infinity. Free from all craving for nothings and oblivions, there is a personal destiny of endless involvement with limitless others. All this spurs you to share your happiness and to release the flow of your love, without the slightest diminution of your ultimate nirvana of indivisible bliss and freedom. Although this kind of freedom spontaneously invested in total involvement, individual bliss indivisible from loving union with all others, is inconceivable in its real meaning within dualistic conceptual terms, it is clear enough what is being claimed. Cessation, extinction, termination of, and freedom from self-addiction are a most plausible doorway to real happiness, true love, and boundless bliss. Once this is clear, it becomes easier to understand what the author means by liberation. If we are not clear about this, there is some risk of misunderstanding the great perfection language as simply urging us to sink into a liberation of the kind of automatic oblivion seemingly awaiting every materialist, with absolutely no need for any sort of scientific foundation or transformational teaching. In order to clarify this essential focus of these teachings, I have translated a short philosophical text that belongs to the natural liberation literature, The Natural Liberation Through Naked Vision, Identifying Intelligence, see Chapter 8. In the passage below from that text, see this page, Padmasambhava has just been mentioning that the reality of freedom, nirvana, truth, and so forth, this itself is the highest goal intended in every sort of Buddhist teaching. To introduce the three-point entrance to this itself, realize past mind as trackless, clear, and void, future mind as unproduced and new, and present awareness as staying natural, uncontrived. Thus knowing time in its very ordinary way. When you nakedly regard yourself, your looking is transparent, nothing to be seen. This is naked, immediate, clear intelligence. It is clear voidness with nothing established, purity of clarity, voidness, non-duality, not permanent, free of any intrinsic status, not annihilated, bright and distinct, not a unity, multi-discerning clarity, without plurality, indivisible, one in taste, not derivative, self-aware, it is this very reality. This introduces the ultimate reality of nirvana, the great perfection, the truth realm, the final freedom, the evolutionary perfection of Buddhahood. This realization is the aim of all the teachings of the Book of Natural Liberation. It is accessible in principle because it is already the deepest reality of the present, the actual condition of even the most ordinary. You must look nakedly at yourself, reversing the aim of seeing back upon itself. You look for that fixed, independent, isolated self that feels like the kernel within you, out of which your drives and thoughts emerge. But when you turn 180 degrees to look within the looking, you find nothing that has intrinsic status, nothing standing independent in its own right. Even Descartes found that too. He found that he could find nothing at the point of origin of thought. He erroneously asserted that it was because a subject could not be an object. And he then went wild and said that this subject, this one thing he could not find, demonstrate, establish in any way, was the one thing he could be foundationally certain of. He could doubt everything, but he could not doubt that he doubted. So, I think, therefore I am. Only the laziest Buddhist philosopher would make such a statement. Not making his mistake, we look nakedly and see nothing established there as a fixed thing in itself. Remember, this is in our seeing itself. We cannot even see anything substantial behind the seeing of nothing. We turn again and again, whirling around pointing to the point of origin of the pointing. Our looking becomes transparent to itself. Nothing is to be seen as independent or objective. And this transparency spreads infinitely. Descartes was right, in one way. The subjective cannot be found. But, subject gone, how can objects remain substantial? A subjectivity that cannot find itself cannot indulge in finding objects out of a sense of certainty in itself. Subjectivity and objectivity both dissolve under penetrating observation of this kind, and all that remains is free, clear transparency. This transparency itself is naked, pure intelligence. It is clarity, immediacy, non-duality, and voidness of all intrinsic status, including any intrinsic status of voidness itself. This bright and clear intelligent awareness is not annihilated, it is not obliviously sunk in union, and it is not rigidly, fixedly dependent, not stuck in a plurality of interrelated yet intrinsically independent entities. Experientially, we enjoy the one taste of freedom without getting lost in isolation. This is the diamond reality of clear light. This is the real nature of each of us that makes natural liberation possible. Our true nature, our Buddha essence, is not something that needs laboriously to be created. It is already overwhelmingly present as our very soul. The soul, furthermore, is not established intrinsically in itself, as a realm of voidness wherein all contents have disappeared. It is rather a realm of voidness wherein all beings and things are transparently present, none independently established in itself, but each present relatively in the inconceivable network of beauty and bliss that is the void. Thus, our Buddha truth body of our freedom wisdom is simultaneously our Buddha beatitude body of bliss, and our Buddha emanation body of love, that reaches out to help other beings rediscover their own free, luminous, blissful, loving natures. As the natural liberation through naked vision says, this page. This objective identification of the actuality of things contains complete in one the indivisible three bodies. The truth body, the voidness free of intrinsic status, the beatific body, bright with freedom's natural energy, the emanation body ceaselessly arising everywhere. Its reality is these three complete in one. I trust it is clear by now that nirvana, the freedom intended by the Book of Natural Liberation, is not oblivion. The truth body is not some absolute aloof transcendence far beyond us. It is the infinite radiance of blissful wisdom energy, beauty enjoying itself unboundedly. And it is simultaneously beauty overflowing in itself as love and goodness, enfolding all beings who pathetically feel themselves apart and alienated in self-addictive isolation. Beings like us. The Book of Natural Liberation itself is the words of Padmasambhava, the lotus-born master, who himself is believed to be the Buddha truth beatific emanation bodies reaching out to us. He does not just sail above us in poetic evocation of his own bliss, he reaches into our present situation tirelessly, seeking to find us where we are, giving us a practical access to our freedom. He challenges our habitual self-alienation from our own reality, as in another passage, this page, from the natural liberation through naked vision. To introduce the forceful method to enter this very reality, your own awareness right now is just this. It being just this uncontrived natural clarity, why do you say, I don't understand the nature of the mind? As here there is nothing to meditate upon. In just this uninterrupted clarity intelligence, why do you say, I don't see the actuality of the mind? Since the thinker in the mind is just it, why do you say, even searching I can't find it? Since here there is nothing to be done, why do you say, whatever I do, it doesn't succeed? As it is sufficient to stay put uncontrived, why do you say, I can't stay still? As it is all right to be content with inaction. Why do you say, I am not able to do it? Since clear, aware, and void are automatically indivisible, why do you say, practice is not effective? Since it is natural, spontaneous, free of cause and condition, why do you say, seeking, it cannot be found? Since thought and natural liberation are simultaneous, why do you say, remedies are impotent? Since your very intelligence is just this, why do you say, I do not know this? These words, each expression simple enough in itself, enable freedom to interlock with our ordinary worries. Like the between guides in the Book of Natural Liberation, they make each gap in our addictive self-obsession a potential doorway into selfless freedom. They proceed by challenging our self-indulgence in self-pitying, artificial remoteness from our salvation. They offer forceful reassurance to lift us up from self-loathing and the fear and trembling it promotes. They cannot harm us unless we misunderstand them as reinforcing the spiritual nihilism so perniciously ingrained within our culture, which misunderstanding we have taken pains to guard against above, by carefully distinguishing between voidness and nothingness, freedom and oblivion. On this secure foundation, let us move on to the Tibetan art of creative dying. And that's not all, our experts and regular viewers respond to all comments. Also check if you forgot to subscribe and set your bell to receive notifications about new audiobooks and other useful self-development materials that we release regularly. Join in the discussions, don't forget to give likes and, if possible and inspired, support the development of the channel financially. All useful links will be in the description and the first attached comment. Goodness, love and wisdom to all. And now move on to watch the next part of the video at the links below, or choose something from the playlists of the channel and those you see on the screen.